More than 24 Russian riders went into this assault as a single elite strike force, and in under 3 minutes, almost none of them were left standing. That number alone does not explain why this ambush is being studied so closely right now. The real shock is not how many motorcycles were destroyed. It is how fast a unit built for speed and precision was turned into wreckage before it ever reached the line it was sent to break. This was not a normal motorcycle wave thrown forward in panic or desperation. Russian commanders built this group differently. Riders were chosen for experience, given tighter coordination, told to move in a staggered formation instead of a straight rush, and briefed to split into smaller teams the moment they crossed into the open approach zone. On paper, this was supposed to be the answer to everything that had gone wrong with earlier motorcycle assaults. Fewer riders bunched together, more separation between teams, a faster, harder target to predict. For weeks, Russian assault planning has been shifting away from heavy armor. Tanks and BMPs are easier to spot from above, and once a Ukrainian reconnaissance drone marks a column, FPV teams and artillery can break the formation before it reaches the trench line. Motorcycles solve part of that problem. They are smaller, faster, and cheaper to lose. A rider can cut across a field in seconds, change direction without warning, and slip through gaps that a tracked vehicle could never use. This elite group was meant to push that advantage further. Instead of one large pack moving together, the unit split into 3 smaller teams approaching from slightly different angles, designed to confuse any single observer trying to track the whole group at once. If one team was spotted, the other 2 were supposed to keep moving and still reach the line. It was a tactic built around the idea that speed plus separation could beat a battlefield watched from above. Earlier motorcycle waves on this front had failed for fairly simple reasons. Riders bunched together out of habit, formations held a straight line for too long, and entire groups followed the same single track, because no one had planned an alternative route in advance. Ukrainian operators learned to expect that pattern, and once they did, a single FPV team waiting at the right choke point could often break an entire wave with 2 or 3 strikes. Russian commanders studied those failures and concluded the problem was discipline, not the concept itself. This unit was the answer to that conclusion. Riders were pulled from more experienced pools, given rehearsed split points along the route, and told to treat the approach less like a charge and more like an infiltration. The thinking was straightforward. If a single mass of motorcycles is an easy pattern to read, then 3 smaller, desynchronized teams should be a harder puzzle to solve in the few minutes available before contact. Stay with this story, because what happened next shows exactly where that idea broke down, and why even Russia's most prepared riders could not outrun a sky that had already been watching them long before they crossed the open ground. The first stage of this ambush began long before the riders ever reached visual range of Ukrainian positions. A reconnaissance UAV had already been holding position over the staging area, watching engines start, watching riders mount up, and recording the order in which the 3 teams left the tree line. From the ground, the launch looked clean. Riders moved out in a tight stagger, throttle steady, spacing controlled, each team peeling off toward its own route, exactly as briefed. From above, the picture told a very different story. 3 separate groups of heat signatures, moving at a consistent rhythm across open and semi-open ground, all originating from the same point, all converging on the same general sector. The drone operator did not need to guess what was forming. The pattern was the assault itself. This is the problem an elite unit cannot train its way out of. Discipline can control spacing, timing, and formation. It cannot make a moving group invisible to a UAV holding contact from several kilometers back. The same coordination that made this unit dangerous on the ground also made its shape easier to read from the air, because 3 synchronized teams moving with purpose look nothing like scattered traffic. They look like a plan. As the lead team crossed into a shallow field corridor, the UAV operator passed coordinates back to a waiting FPV team. No one rushed the strike. The riders were still too far out, still moving too fast, and too unpredictably for a clean hit. So the watchers waited, tracking the route, marking the place where the field corridor narrowed between a drainage ditch and a tree line, the one stretch where every rider in that lead team would have to slow down or risk losing control. That is the moment a fast assault becomes a trap. Speed only protects a rider as long as the ground allows it. The instant the terrain forces a slowdown, even for 2 or 3 seconds, the advantage flips entirely to whoever has been waiting. The lead rider entered that narrow stretch first, easing off the throttle just enough to hold the bike steady through the rougher ground. For a moment, nothing happened. Then an FPV drone came in, low and fast from the side, locked onto the center of the bike, and struck before the rider had any time to react. The motorcycle went down hard, throwing dust and smoke across the path behind it. What had been a smooth, fast-moving line broke apart in an instant. The second rider, only a few bike lengths behind, had no room to stop cleanly and swerved hard to avoid the wreck, losing control on the soft edge of the ditch. The third rider slowed too sharply, clipped the edge of the path, and went down without ever being touched by a drone at all. In seconds, panic did more damage to that lead team than the first strike alone. This is where an elite unit's training starts working against it instead of for it. These riders had been told to keep moving, to trust the spacing, to push through resistance rather than scatter. But the orders that made sense in a briefing room collapse the moment the person in front of you is on fire, and the path forward no longer exists. Some riders tried to follow their training and push past the wreck. Others broke from the route entirely, cutting toward the tree line on instinct rather than instruction. From above, this is exactly the kind of moment Ukrainian operators wait for. A single hit rarely finishes an assault group. What finishes it is the panic, the loss of formation, the moment when a coordinated unit stops behaving like one. Once that happens, every rider becomes an individual problem to solve, and individual problems are far easier to remove than a moving formation. The second team, watching the chaos unfold ahead of them from a parallel route, faced an impossible choice. Slow down and risk losing the timing of the whole assault, or push forward and ride straight into the same stretch of ground that had just collapsed the lead team. Their commander chose speed, gambling that momentum could carry them past the danger before another drone found the gap. It did not work. A second FPV, already repositioned by an operator who had been watching the second team's approach the entire time, came in from a different angle than the first strike. This rider had no warning at all. The bike was hit mid-stride, sending it tumbling across the open ground, while the next two riders behind scattered in opposite directions rather than risk the same fate. By this point, what had been 3 disciplined teams moving with purpose had become a scattered group of individuals trying to survive in open terrain, with no clear route forward and no way to regroup. Some riders abandoned their motorcycles entirely and ran for the nearest cover, choosing a slower but less visible escape over a faster one that had already proven fatal twice. Others tried to circle back toward the staging area, hoping distance alone could buy them enough time to disappear from view. That decision created the next layer of the ambush. A retreating rider moving back across open ground is no longer protecting an objective. He is simply a target moving in a predictable direction, away from cover, with no reason to expect contact from behind. A third FPV picked up one of these retreating riders less than a minute after the second strike, following the bike's path along a worn dirt track before closing the final distance and ending the retreat before it reached the safety of the tree line. The third team, still mostly intact, and watching this entire sequence happen from a distance, made the only choice that gave them any real chance. They abandoned the approach completely, breaking formation and scattering into the nearest terrain that could offer concealment, rather than continuing toward the original objective. It was the only decision in this entire sequence that did not immediately result in a kill, and it only worked because the team chose survival over the mission, the moment the mission was clearly already lost. What makes this ambush different from a normal motorcycle's assault failing under pressure is what happened next, because Russian command did not simply write off the loss. A light vehicle was sent forward to try to recover wounded riders and pull survivors out of the open ground, treating this as a rescue operation, rather than accepting that the approach zone itself was still being watched. That decision extended the kill zone rather than closing it. The recovery vehicle moved along the same general route the lead teams had used, slower and more cautious this time, but still visible to the same reconnaissance drone that had never lost contact with the area. As it approached the wreckage of the first downed motorcycle, a fourth strike came in, not because the vehicle was especially valuable, but because it had moved directly into a sector that Ukrainian forces had already mapped down to the meter. This is the deeper lesson hidden inside this single failed assault. It was never really about the motorcycles themselves. It was about how Russian forces, even an elite unit briefed and trained specifically to counter drone surveillance through speed and separation, still could not escape a battlefield where every meter of open ground had already been seen, marked and prepared for, before a single rider crossed the line. But the pressure on this unit did not end once the drones had finished their work. Once the lead teams were broken and the recovery vehicle was burning beside the path, Ukrainian artillery began landing rounds along the same corridor, not aimed at any single target, but spread across the stretch of ground where survivors were most likely to be moving. This is a deliberate follow-up tactic. FPV drones can pick off individual riders and vehicles with precision, but artillery denies the ground itself, forcing anyone still alive in that sector to keep moving through open terrain rather than settle into one position and wait for rescue. For the third team, the one that had broken formation early and scattered into nearby cover, this changed the calculation completely. Staying still no longer guaranteed safety, because the artillery did not need to see them to make their position unstable. Several riders chose to keep moving in short bursts between impacts, trying to reach a drainage line that offered at least partial concealment from above. It was a reasonable decision in the moment, and it very nearly worked, because for almost an hour, that group avoided any further contact at all. Darkness eventually fell over the sector, and for a brief period, it looked as though the third team might be the one part of this assault that survived intact. But night does not remove a unit from a battlefield this heavily watched. It only changes how that unit becomes visible again. As the ground cooled, the heat signatures of riders moving between cover points began to stand out more clearly through thermal optics than they had in daylight. And a reconnaissance drone that had quietly repositioned over the drainage line picked up exactly that kind of movement a little after dusk. One more FPV strike came in under cover of darkness, guided entirely by heat rather than sight. It did not destroy the entire remaining team in a single pass, but it confirmed their position beyond any doubt. And from that point forward, every attempt to relocate only created another signature for the drone above to follow. By the time this third team finally reached anything resembling safety, it was no longer the disciplined unit that had left the staging area hours earlier. It was a handful of exhausted riders who had survived only by abandoning almost everything the original plan had told them to do. 3 minutes. That is roughly how long it took from the first FPV strike on the lead rider to the final hit on the recovery vehicle, trying to pull survivors out. In that window alone, an assault force built around discipline, training, and a genuinely smarter approach than earlier motorcycle waves was reduced to scattered wreckage, abandoned bikes, and a handful of riders who survived only because they broke from the plan the moment it stopped making sense. Everything that happened after, the artillery denying the open ground, the third team's slow retreat, the final strike guided by heat in the dark, was simply the battlefield finishing what those first 3 minutes had already decided. The wider question this raises is not really about motorcycles, ATVs, or any single piece of equipment Russia chooses to send forward next. It is about whether speed and smaller formations can ever fully solve a problem that is fundamentally about visibility. A reconnaissance drone holding contact for several minutes before the first shot is fired does not care how disciplined the riders below are, or how cleverly their teams are separated. It only needs the ground to force a slowdown once, somewhere along the route, and patience does the rest. Russian commanders may look at this failure and conclude the unit simply needs better coordination, better timing, or a different route next time. But the pattern across recent weeks suggests something harder to fix with training alone. Every adjustment Russia makes to move faster and lighter is being met by a surveillance and strike system that does not need to be faster. It only needs to be patient, and right now, patience is winning more often than speed. There is also a quieter cost to this kind of failure that does not show up in the wreckage count alone. Elite units take longer to build than ordinary motorcycle waves. The riders pulled into this group were the ones with the most experience, the steadiest hands under pressure, and the clearest understanding of how to operate without constant direction from above. Losing that kind of unit in under 3 minutes does not just remove 20-odd motorcycles from the battlefield. It removes the small pool of trained riders Russia was counting on to make every future version of this tactic better. The next attempt, whenever it comes, will likely be led by less experienced replacements, trying to repeat a plan that has already failed once under far more favorable conditions than they are likely to get. So the question this ambush leaves behind is a difficult one. For any side relying on quick, light assaults to regain momentum on this front, if an elite unit built specifically to beat drone detection can still be wiped out in under 3 minutes, what kind of approach is actually left that does not end the same way? Let us know what you think in the comments. If this breakdown helped you understand how quickly a fast assault can collapse on a battlefield watched from above, like this video, share it with someone following this war closely, and subscribe for more clear analysis on the weapons, tactics, and turning points shaping the front line.